All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about how Stalin and the Soviet leadership around him just ignored the fact that the Germans were planning on invading the Soviet Union. The Germans were planning on invading the Soviet Union. They were planning on invading Russia, invading Moscow. And they were all of these Soviet intelligence agents who knew that the Germans were coming. And they did not remain silent. They didn't hide this information. They actually conveyed this information to Stalin. And Stalin really didn't give a damn. He didn't. He would call such warnings disinformation. Do not give me disinformation, because remember, the Russians and the Germans, the Soviets and the Germans, had an alliance. They had a deal. And Stalin supposedly really believed that the Germans weren't coming. He just could not believe that the Germans were actually planning on invading the Soviet Union. For example, there was one Soviet intelligence officer who had a source in the German Air Force. And the source told this intelligence officer, this Soviet intelligence officer, that the Germans were coming, that they were going to invade the Soviet Union. They were going to invade Russia. This intelligence officer sends this information to Stalin. And Stalin tells this intelligence officer, go take this information from your source in the German Air Force and give it to this source's effing mother. Yes, this is pretty much what Stalin said. I'm sort of paraphrasing, but he actually used the term his effing mother. This is how Stalin replied to somebody who was a watchman for the Soviet Union. And there was also the Soviet ambassador to Berlin, Mr. Dekhanozov. Mr. Dekhanozov had a communication from the German ambassador to the Soviet Union. His name was Schulenburg, Mr. Schulenburg. And Schulenburg was a Russophile, so he sympathized with the Russians to whatever extent. And Schulenburg told Dekhanozov that the Germans were preparing an invasion of the Soviet Union. Dekhanozov sends out this warning, and Stalin basically said this is just disinformation. In one instance, Mr. Dekhanozov spoke with the head of the NKVD. His last name was Beria. He was the one behind the Katyn massacre, in which the Soviets massacred tens of thousands of Polish army officers. And Mr. Beria told Stalin that Mr. Dekhanozov, the Soviet ambassador to Berlin, should be held accountable for spreading misinformation. There were German deserters who fled the German military, went to the Russians, and told the Soviets that the Germans were on their way to invade the Soviet Union. Do you know what Stalin said of those German deserters who were giving the Soviets very vital information? Stalin said, shoot them. He ordered those German deserters to be shot, not because they were deserters, but because they were spreading misinformation. There was a Soviet intelligence officer, Richard Sarche, and Sarche was a spy who was doing his spying mission in Japan. He was actually spying on the Japanese, and he was figuring out what the Japanese were saying within their own parliament. He was picking up a lot of very vital information about what the Japanese were saying, and he was a very capable intelligence officer. He also warned Stalin about a coming German invasion, and he was dismissed as spreading disinformation. Oh, and his warning was labeled as provocation. Yeah. So this is how Stalin treated people who were warning him about the worst disaster that the Soviet Union would ever suffer. The worst disaster that Russia, actually, would ever suffer. Tens of millions of Russians were killed by the Nazis. It was so horrendous. And I was reading about how the Nazis treated Soviet POWs. The way that the Nazis treated Soviet POWs was way, way worse than how they treated American or British POWs. You might hear a story, maybe on the History Channel, about, or you might hear some old American World War II vet on the History Channel say something like, "Oh yes, I was a POW in a Nazi POW camp, and they treated me okay, and the Germans weren't that bad actually." That's because the Germans treated the Americans a lot nicer than they did the Soviets or the Russians or the Slavs in general.
The Russians were also there. Everybody they were fighting was in that camp. And they were treated the Russians horribly because Russia was not a member of the Geneva Conference. Mm-hmm. And the way they treated each other was terrible. Mm-hmm. I saw a guard one day. There was a big camp, big. There were two guys working on some wire down below us, and he looked. He saw them. They were Russians, and he yells at them. They couldn't hear him. They were 100 yards away or more under another guard, mm-hmm. and he shot them both. Mm-hmm. Right on. Just killed them.
And that's because the Americans were under a number of conventions, so I think the Germans were more wary of mass murdering American POWs than they were murdering Russians. And this had a lot to do with the ideology of the Nazis, because the Nazis, for example, when they had a POW who was Flemish, right? And by Flemish, I'm talking about people from Flanders. For those of you who don't know, Belgium, is Belgium really a legitimate country? Half the country is Flemish, half the country is Wallonian. Flemish people are basically Dutch people. They're just Dutch people who ended up just being stuck in something called Belgium. And Wallonians are just French people who ended up just getting stuck in the southern part of Belgium. We say, oh, they're not French, they're not Dutch, they're Flemish, they're Flemings, and they're Wallonian, okay, whatever. But when there was a Fleming, meaning someone from Flanders, the northern part of Belgium, when there was a Fleming in a German POW camp, he was treated better than a Wallonian in a German POW camp. So a Wallonian, because he was French, was considered to be inferior to a Fleming. They would treat their Germanic neighbors better than they would their Slavic enemies. When the Nazis occupied a Slavic country, they treated the country like a Confederate racist would treat a slave. They treated the person as if he was inferior. It was straight up social Darwinist racism. They were actually, I brought up the Confederacy. The Nazis were way worse than the Confederacy, but you understand the comparison I'm making here. They really saw the Slavs as inferior in the social Darwinist paradigm. And when they had Slavic POWs, or really, to be more relevant to the topic at hand, when they had Soviet POWs, they treated those POWs worse. They treated them as if they were lower than animals. For example, I'll give you guys a statistic here. And this is very, very revealing. So it says here, in this book I've been reading, The Third Reich by Michael Burleigh, it says here that between the 1941 invasion and 1945, some 5,700,000 Red Army soldiers were captured by the Germans and their allies. 930,000 of these men and women were recovered alive from German prisoner of war camps in January 1945. As many as 1 million further prisoners had been released during the war, many of them more or less voluntarily serving the Wehrmacht in either combat or auxiliary capacities. Another 500,000 had managed to escape or had been liberated by the Red Army. The remainder, consisting of about 3,300,000 prisoners, or 57.5% of the original total, had died in captivity. Why? Because the Germans believed that the Soviets, the Slavs, were inferior, and Hitler would just ramble for hours about his fantasy of what he was going to do once the Reich takes over all of Europe, once the Reich had taken over all of Russia, all of Eastern Europe. He said, in the future Reich, we will control this huge chunk of the territory around the Black Sea, and we will control the Black Sea, and Germans will go to the Black Sea. They'll go to the beaches of the Black Sea to vacation, and we will control Russia just like the English controlled India with only a few hundred soldiers. And every year we will have these giant markets set up where our people, because he wanted to repopulate the Slavic lands with Germans. So every year we will set up these giant markets in Russia, and our people will go to the markets and will buy out all of the best fresh produce, all of the wheat grown in these Slavic countries. And then we will give these Slavic peoples our low-quality produce grown in Germany. And he would just ramble on and on like this for hours, and the officials around him would have to listen to him for hours. But then when he would leave the room, they would say, this guy is freaking crazy. But going back to Joseph Stalin really ignored all of the warnings. And because he ignored all of the warnings, Russia went through the greatest point of suffering, the greatest duration of suffering, the most horrendous suffering that it had ever gone through in its history. And it came to the point where you had Russian POWs in these camps where they were starved to the point where numerous of them would actually resort to cannibalism. And there was one story I read where a Soviet POW died. I think he was executed. And other Soviet POWs took his corpse and ate it. And that's how horrific this was. It was a horror. Just absolute horror. Just absolute horror. And this horror happened because the Germans, the Nazis, had this diabolical ideology of social Darwinism. They invaded the Soviet Union with this genocidal ideology at hand. But the Soviets, specifically Stalin and people like Beria, they believed that they could manage the Germans, that they could manage the Nazis. And what do you see happening today? You see the Russians, and we've been seeing this for a number of years now. We have been seeing the Russians thinking that they can manage Germany, that they can manage Turkey. So, for example, the Russians and the Germans agreed to have a Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and this was all done to the ire of the Americans. The Russians financed the construction of the pipeline, and you had European companies who were involved in its construction. The pipeline was completed, but before it could go into operation, it was destroyed. Why? Because the Americans didn't want it there. And why are the Americans so terrified of Russia directly sending natural gas to the Germans? Because the Americans are terrified of the Russians pulling the Germans away from America's sphere of power. And they are terrified of the Russians pulling Turkey away from America's sphere of power. And you will see, the Turks and the Russians have killed each other within recent years. I remember back in, I want to say in 2020, in February of 2020, I believe, in Syria. The Russians and their Syrian allies killed dozens of Turkish soldiers in Syria. Turks have also killed Russians, but they're not at war. Why? Because Russia wants to maintain diplomacy. Plus, Russia cannot afford to have a war on multiple fronts because it already has enough in its hands in Ukraine. But when you see Russia and Turkey maintaining ties, this is Russia trying to pull Turkey away from America's sphere of influence. And when we saw Germany and Russia agree to have a Nord Stream 2 pipeline and actually create the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to the anger and the rage of the Americans, that was Russia trying to pull Germany away from America and have an alliance with Germany and have an alliance with Turkey with the hopes of creating a pact against NATO. That's what this is. And I remember years ago hearing George Friedman, the guy who founded Stratfor, which is a big think tank, say that America's biggest fear is a Russo-German alliance. Because with Germany, you have just now lost Europe's biggest economy. You have lost the EU's biggest country. And with Turkey, if NATO loses Turkey to Russia, then that means that NATO will lose its gateway into the Black Sea from the Mediterranean. It will lose the Dardanelles. It will lose the Straits into the Sea of Marmara. Extremely vital geopolitical positions. And this is the reason why one of the reasons why at least Russia wants to pull Turkey away from America's sphere of power. But what is this? This is Russia believing that it can take these countries into its fold and manage them. And what was Stalin and Hitler making a pact together? What was that? Well, part of that was the Germans basically giving the finger to the Americans. The Germans were tired. The Germans didn't like the fact that the Americans were running the world. The Americans dominated the world with their American gold standard, which had eclipsed the British silver sterling. And the Germans were tired of America's domination. The Japanese were also tired of America's domination. So by the Nazis making a pact with the Soviets, it was a part of the Germans working towards toppling the United States. But because the Russians and the Germans were historical enemies, and the Germans wanted to take all of the territory of the Soviet Union to take its resources and to establish some sort of racial, Darwinistic utopia, the Germans were planning on invading the Soviet Union. And the pact that it had with the Soviet Union, that was all just for a particular purpose. But the Germans and the Russians were going to go to war anyway. So what would happen if today the Russians and the Turks make an alliance, even against NATO? The Turks and the Russians would still have a war. Why? Because the Turks want to revive their neo-Ottomanist empire. The Russians want to control the Black Sea. Turkey is a nation of the Black Sea. It's a Black Sea country. Turkey wants to control Syria. The Russians also want to control Syria. So you have two regional powers that have agendas that are antithetical to each other. So a Russo-Turkish war is inevitable. Same thing with Germany. Germany wants to dominate Europe. And Germany has been deploying troops into Lithuania. Why? To counter the Russians in the Baltics. To prepare for a war with the Russians. And so when you see all of this movement happening, when you see Germany working to make a powerful military force, when you see the Germans working to become the biggest, strongest military in the EU, and when you, for example, hear talk coming out of Europe coming out of Germany actually, saying that if a NATO army deploys its military into Ukraine, that it would still be that it would not be against international law. When you see this sort of rhetoric happening, and when you see, for example, Mr. Claude Juncker, the former the guy who used to head the EU Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, when you read his statement from a number of years ago in which he said that Europe must basically replace the United States, in the sense that Europe must become an independent power. Translation, Germany must lead Europe, not America. When you see all this rhetoric, it's very obvious what's happening. You see a rising Turkey, a rising Germany, you see a rising Russia. And Turkey and Germany are both countries that historically have had a number of major wars against the Russians. So it's all very obvious. But the mistake that people are making is thinking that they can manage these countries, that Russia is thinking we can pull Turkey away from NATO, we can pull Germany away from NATO. And at least the Russians did think this in regards to Germany in the past. I don't know exactly what they're thinking now. I think it's very obvious that the Germans are preparing for a war with the Russians, and it's obvious that the Russians know about this. I mean, if I know about it, and if people in the media are talking about it, obviously the Russians do know about it. But in the past, I believe that Russia's purpose of having the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Germany was not just to bypass Poland and Ukraine, because the Russians had to anytime they had to ship out natural gas into Europe, they had to go through the Ukrainians and the Poles, and they had to give a lot of money to the Ukrainians, billions of dollars to the Ukrainians in transit fees. So one of the purposes of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was to bypass Ukraine and Poland and basically render these countries as insignificant. One of the other purposes was to pull the Germans away from NATO. This is the reason why Americans were so upset by it, and that's the reason why the Americans destroyed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. But I think that the Germans still want to maintain some sort of ties with the Russians. This is why after Macron started rambling about sending NATO troops into Ukraine to fight the Russians, Olaf Scholz came out and said, we do not want conflict with the Russians. So Germany is still trying to maintain ties with the Russians. But the fact is that the Germans are building up their military. Stalin really believed that he could manage the Germans, and that ended up not being true. We cannot ignore the lessons of history. Mankind cannot ignore the lessons of history without that indifference being to mankind's demise. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.